Yeah, really excited to be here today to be sharing with you about our work, Enlace's work in Portland, Oregon. We were successful in pushing the city to become the first in the country, the only in the country, to stop investing in all corporate securities because of an intersectional divestment campaign that we led, starting with prison divestment as our main demand. But over the course of a 4-year struggle with City Council, we were able to bring in more demands in a united front that pushed the city to stop investing in all corporate securities, which is incredibly huge. We've seen powerful intersectional prison divestment victories at the city and campus level in different capacities, but this is the first one that really pushed for complete divestment and allows space for new things around anti-criminalization and pushing back against immigration enforcement, and also rethinking how financial institutions are used as a cornerstone to oppress Black and Brown and immigrant communities. So share a little bit about like the victories that that happened within our 4-year campaign. So we started in 2013. The prison divestment campaign has been around actually since 2010. We were called to start it nationally by our member organizations who recognized that the biggest threat to low-wage worker organizing that they were facing in like the 08-09 timeframe was actually immigration enforcement. And so that tasked us at the national level to push for the prison divestment campaign, which launched in 2010. And then after a couple of years of focusing on corporate targets, we realized that we really needed to be taking on local institutions and recognizing the way that all of our municipalities, our campuses, our state pension funds, our pension funds as private employees are actually tied up in this web of profiting off of the detention and caging of people of color and immigrants, and that there's a way that our local governments can address that complicity and can push back against it. So we started out in Portland, Oregon, with a municipal campaign strategy that we hoped would become a model for the rest of the country. So that started in 2013. In 2014, we were successful in pushing the city to adopt a socially responsible investing policy that included a human rights criteria as an impact that the city would have to assess in making its investments, which is, to our knowledge, the first in the country as well. And then we also, part of the city's process, they instituted a committee to oversee and make recommendations around what companies to not buy bonds in. And we were successful in making sure that that wasn't just a bunch of white male bankers and folks with ties to development and the finance industry, and that actually reflected members of our community from the workers, from immigrant community, teachers, and especially like folks of color just being on that board, which is incredibly important here in super white Oregon and super white Portland. And then we got that committee that was stacked with our people to actually vote to divest from prison banks and from Caterpillar, which is a company that that Trump had chosen basically as one of his ideal companies to build the border wall, and also is involved in the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And so what we were actually capable of, what we accomplished in April 2017, we got complete divestment from all corporations, which is a huge, huge victory with hundreds of folks involved in achieving that. And so what I'd love to share with you all today, and we can get into practices that you all have used in your campaigns to move your work forward. But I'd really like to share some practices that we use that we think are very much in line with the Freedom Cities framework and narrative, and we see as best practices and lessons learned from our fight here in Portland. So first of all, practice, this one is more of like at the national level, but we focused on pushing for divestment from the Million Shares Club. And so the Million Shares Club is a list of companies and hedge funds that that own over 1 million shares of prison stock in either Core Civic, formerly CCA, and Geo Group. So these are companies that invest heavily. You know, they get a sweet return on their investment, and they also 6 of them are major lenders to the private prison industry, and those are Wells Fargo, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, US Bank Corp, and SunTrust, and I believe PNB Paribas are the major ones. And through their lending and their investing, they allow for the expansion of the private prison industry, as well as that industry's lobbying at the federal and at local levels for increased attention, more contracts, policies that lock up Black and brown folks. And so Enlace maintains an updated list, and that's available on our website at that link there. Recently, the private prison industry got a tax-free status that allows them to, under the tax cam bill that was passed earlier this year, that allows them to pass on all of their profits to these big banks that own the majority of stock in the private prison companies. And so we're seeing an even tidier, like cozier relationship between big banks and the for-profit prison industry. So another practice was about making it real for the city council here in Portland. We needed to impress upon them the urgency and also that we had the right targets. So the city didn't have any direct investments in private prison companies. So they were only invested in private prisons through the Million Shares Club, through their investments specifically in like Wells Fargo, Bank of New York Mellon, which no one here had ever heard about really, and JP Morgan Chase. And so we needed to make it really real that those were the right targets, and that the community understood that those were the right targets and understood the role of those banks in propping up the private prison industry. We also had to show that the effect of the private prison industry was actually felt on the Portland community. It was important to us, not just from abstract way, but actually was impacting the lives of folks here on the ground. And so even though there's no private prisons locally, there's no private prisons in the state of Oregon, we're able to demonstrate that anyone that is picked up by ICE locally, if they're held for more than 24 hours, is taken up to a Geo Group private prison facility in Tacoma, Washington, which is about 2.5, 3 hours away. And that had enormous impacts on immigrant families here, folks who were having to scrap together money to bail people out, or whose family members stayed there for years under the horrific conditions there, and sacrificed so much just to go visit, and of course have their family member detained and out of their lives in the community. So we really focused on uplifting what the stories that were coming out of the Tacoma Detention Center at the time that we started the campaign. When we started the campaign, there was a hunger strike going on there, and we were able to show that there were folks from Portland that were their family members were being detained and were involved in the hunger strike. And then when they got out, we brought them in to share their stories and to lift up what they had seen inside and the need to shut these detention centers down, and how Portland, by divesting, could take a lead role in that. We also worked really intensely with the Vos Day Labor Center and working with their members to demonstrate and show and lift up the stories of how they've been impacted by immigrant detention. And so this photo here on the bottom is actually the Day Laborers coming up with a teatro about how many actors were making money off of incarceration and detention of immigrants. The other practice that we had was around the way we built up our coalitions here. So this was a 4-year fight, and so we had to be really intentional about the way that we work together to keep pushing this forward, to not have burnout, not have fatigue, not have relationships go awry within that 4-year journey that we took together. So first of all, in terms of building the coalition, we prioritized not the folks that had the most political power, but we prioritized bringing in the groups that were the most directly impacted by criminalization. So lots of Black-led groups, lots of immigrant-led groups, lots of Latinx groups were at the center of coming together first and setting strategy and recognizing the different ways that they were impacted by criminalization within the context of pushing the city to divest from prisons. And then we also brought in ally groups. And so, you know, folks from the faith community, folks from civil rights organizations, criminal reform organizations, labor, teachers, international solidarity groups, human rights-based organizations. And at first, when we were working together, we kind of had an open table. But as the fight went on, we prioritized the groups that had been, that were led by or their base was made up of the most directly impacted people. And so those groups were our core strategy group. And the ally organizations kind of fell back and were not involved in meetings every month or hustling to meet like right before to set strategy before key moments in the campaign. Instead, that was the core strategy group of folks that were directly impacted. And the relationships had been built over time with the ally organizations to fall in behind the leadership of the folks most directly impacted. That was key, and I feel like that's one of the most important parts of how this campaign fits within the Freedom Cities model. We also, I think it's really important to think about how to do that work, how to do Freedom Cities work that's led by directly impacted folks in white majority cities. And so it was a strategy that really worked well for us. Let's see. I'd be remiss to say that it was the core strategy group was also mostly women and trans folks of color. We were also able to like welcome new groups into this coalition space, but within the structure where the core strategy group was the one setting it. And we were able to communicate that to like when ACLU Oregon like joined the table much later, they knew what their role was and that it was just to support and use their political power and influence sort of in a very particular way, but not to be setting strategy and taking away the leadership from folks who were most impacted and had been putting in the work the longest. It also became really important for us to do political education of bases. And so Enlace is sort of the hub for this coalition. Did a lot of work with groups one-on-one to figure out how to engage their base to do political education in a way that would resonate with their community, with their base, but also that would bring in the other narrative points that were important, other ways that other communities were impacted by criminalization, by private prisons, into their work. And so, for example, in like working with day labor communities, mostly Latinx and Spanish speaking, we would make sure to bring in the other ways of criminalization, make sure to convey that the work that we were doing was intentionally pro-Black, and that the way that the system operates, the private prison system operates, is just profiting off of parallel systems of control of people of color. And there was a deep like understanding of that within the coalition space and within the membership of groups in the coalition. And as we brought more folks into the work, it became, and with this structure of folks that were in the prison divestment coalition and other coalitions were forming, sort of excited about the human rights impact criteria that I'll talk about again in a little bit. That opened up space for other coalitions to form that were really excited to push the city to change its investing to be more human rights based centered, we had like one person on our team from the hub organization that was actually relaying to all of those groups and going into some of their meetings, participating and helping them develop strategy, but without like creating a huge table where we didn't necessarily have trust with all of the organizations, especially some of the some of the other coalitions that were forming were non-directly impacted led and white led. And so not necessarily wanting to like invite them into the core strategy group space, right? So person on our team would go relay and communicate between like what we were doing so that we could all share each other's talking points, we could develop press strategies together, that making sure that we were still following and honoring the core directly impacted strategy group's vision. Another practice that we had to, that we learned a lot from was embracing the unexpected wins. So our original demand back in 2013, actually, there's two pieces here to uplift. Like our original demand was sort of for a one and done resolution that would have just taken on prison divestment and pushed the city to stop investing in those companies. And if we had won that, we wouldn't be having this webinar right now. That was definitely pushed just by like Enlace, and we had other groups that were in support of it, but it wasn't done with deep coalition and movement building, and didn't further an expansive narrative, and it also didn't really build up our political power in the way that I'll talk about in a second. So if we'd won that, this would have been over. Instead, we got the socially responsible investing policy, which dragged out this process much longer, but allowed us to build so much along the way. So we had originally, for the socially responsible investing policy, asked for a criteria to be added to that policy that was really actually kind of awkward to think about looking back. It was like we wanted a criteria that the city would not invest in companies that were involved in the caging of people of color or the caging of other people or something like that. It was very much focused on incarceration. One is like we currently define it, or defined it a couple years ago, and as we know, like incarceration and surveillance is shifting pretty rapidly, and it also it was just super narrow. And so we were, after we had so many folks testify on the floor about how they had been personally impacted by the Tacoma facility, how they were impacted by criminalization, and how they saw those things tied back to federal policies lobbied for by private prisons. The city council was actually really moved by that, and they, on the floor, introduced human rights impact criteria to the socially responsible investing policy. And so that was a ginormous win, and allowed us to, a lot of other groups to come into the narrative. And so that opened the door for folks involved in boycott, divest, sanctions to bring in companies that they wanted divestment from due to those companies' involvement in the Israeli occupation of Palestine. It opened the door in other ways for the fossil fuel divestment groups to think a little bit more about climate justice impacts. And it also opened the door when the moment later arose for defund DAPL groups and indigenous sovereignty groups to come in and lay out that analysis. And so through this win, we were able to actually have like a really strong coalition later, right? And a really impactful narrative. And so from this, I think it's important to learn that, what our vision is at any given time can actually be unexpectedly narrow. And that's just an opportunity for us to constantly be learning from that, and pushing ourselves to be more expansive, not just focused on a single issue or what seems winnable at the time. And also, I think of this piece that Adrienne Mary Brown puts into Emergent Strategies around how like the horizon will always be shifting, right? And so based off of this win, we were able to shift what was possible so much more. So the other practice is community control of resources, and this is a key part of the Freedom Cities platform. And we accomplished that at multiple levels along the way of this campaign. I think the most important one was that we pushed for the Socially Responsible Investment Committee, and we got that through resolution language, and then we pushed the City Council to include language in the resolution that the committee that they appointed would reflect the diversity of Portland. We asked for something that was much more specific about including impacted people and people of color, and they whitewashed it and watered it down a bit, but we still got what we wanted. And then we followed through and pushed them to appoint our people. And so we were able to have 3 folks that were on our side, and then they were able, through this long process with the city, we're able to bring in, like, shift the spectrum of allies of those folks a little bit, and like one person kind of came over to be pushed further left and against the private prison banks. And those folks were also able to like better hear and respect and respond to the powerful testimony of people who had been detained and the family members of people who were detained. And so here in one of the pictures, the picture on the left is the mother of a man who'd been detained in the GEO facility for 4 years after a criminal conviction. And in front of her is another man who was a leader in the hunger strikes in Tacoma, Paulino Ruiz. And then in this picture on the right is this boring room that was the Socially Responsible Investment Committee group, right? And so if we're ever going to be, I see Freedom Cities leading us to like, how do we actually build to win? And part of it is getting our people in these boring rooms so that they're doing the work and governing, right? And taking over, maybe they're not elected positions, but they're taking over positions that we have access to, that we're building into our campaigns, and that have the capacity to actually further shift resources to impacted communities. And then another practice was pivoting targets. So we, as I mentioned, this was a 4-year campaign, and there was quite a bit of lag time. And so because we had built such a strong, powerful coalition, and a coalition that welcomed other coalition spaces, other coalition groups into this wider net that we built, we were able to successfully like cycle up our power in a couple different moments. So we were able to pressure Senator Ron Wyden to introduce the Ending Tax Breaks for Private Prisons Act in 2016. And then he even subsequently reintroduced that last year. So that's still just awaiting being sent to committee in Congress. And so this was this is a bill that would take away the tax breaks that I mentioned earlier for private prisons, so that they would be unable to, one, they'd be forced to pay taxes. Right now they're getting both all of their money coming from our tax dollars, and they get tax subsidies on top of that. And at the time when we won this, like, we were thinking about, well, how does this victory actually allow us to, when we thought the election would go differently, how does this allow us to push forward and think about how we could be targeting the Clinton administration as what we thought was going to be coming in? How can we target them to completely divest from private prisons in terms of contracts? Obama had said that the Bureau of Prisons contracts were going to go away for private prisons. We were like, well, how do we use both this piece that we're able to win locally because of our local coalition's power, and this other work that's happening at the national level to cycle up power and keep winning? And if Trump hadn't won, I think we would have been there. I think we would have succeeded in pushing forward that vision. And then at the local level, again, even though the state of Oregon doesn't have any private prisons, we were able to push a local state senator to introduce a bill to pull out state pension money from private prisons. And there is actually, the state pension is directly invested in private prisons as well as prison banks. And she adopted both pieces of that analysis and those demands. Oops. And then the last thing I'll say, and it kind of goes actually back to this community control of resources. We've seen that our campaign pretty immediately led to folks. So it wasn't just divestment groups that were interested in what we were doing and excited by it. There was also municipal banking groups that have been pushing for the creation of a municipal bank in Portland based off of the narrative, the analysis that we're able to push forward around Wells Fargo, which is the city's bank. And so that tied into demands to shut down the city's banking contract with Wells Fargo and create a new municipal bank. There's also been a lot of work that's related around cutting the police budget. So seeing that was actually some folks involved in our coalition and other criminal reform groups pushing for successfully for a reduction in the increase in police budget that the city wanted. There's still an increase, but they got it like significantly reduced. And then we're seeing how the boycott, divest, sanctions groups have been cycling this up and this victory and using it to basically be a platform for trying to end city contracts with other companies that are involved in the Israeli occupation of Palestine, like G4S, security for City Hall, trying to push the city to make resolutions of condemnation around the anti-BDS bill that was proposed and introduced into Congress, as well as condemn how Israeli occupation has been around the right to return. So I'll pass it back to you, Pearl. I think you're on mute.
There we go. Good. Just was thanking you, Jamie. Thanking you for reminding us that the horizon is constantly changing. And so how do we accordingly innovate on our practices to make sure that we are including as many people as possible in our vision for liberation? And as we've heard from you, talking about the ways in which divestment has opened the doors for so much more, more than just divesting from private prisons, but all pieces around community control that you just mentioned. We'd love to hear from the folks in the room through an open share, whether that's asking any questions of Jamie, any curiosities that were piqued, any specifics that you might want more information on from Jamie or the other participants in this space. Or if you want to share examples of divestment strategies that you're using in your own work, or any divestment ideas that you're called to in this particular moment. Just wanted to open the floor to hear from y'all as well. You're on mute. Oh, we can't hear you. One idea is to maybe chat the question or comment. As you do that, just a reminder that there's also a button on the bottom left of the screen that says enable.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't know.
Oh,
we can hear you now.
Yeah.
I I'm actually unmuted. I don't know what's going on.
It works.
Awesome. Good. So you don't have to wait for me to type. So one of the things I was wondering, Jamie, so thank you. I know like one of the challenges that we have here in Los Angeles is that I'm curious about how that relationship building and that coalition building was with ally organizations, especially ally organizations who have a tendency or a practice on the real to be very aligned with either the politicians and sort of that status quo. Just because I think that's a constant challenge here in the context in Los Angeles among organizations, even organizations who claim to be base building organizations. So I'm just a little curious about how the response was and how that relationship was and how you dealt with that tension if there was any.
Yeah, so we focused actually on reaching out and building power with the groups that were most in line with like our vision around how we build power, how we win, what we want to win. So there's a couple things going on there. Portland is like its own little animal and like way behind, like all the organizing that's happening is way behind like where folks are at in LA and in other big cities, right? So we had the space to be able to create the space we wanted. So that was huge. And I don't want to pretend like that wasn't something that allowed us to win this way. But I think we also we didn't bring in folks that we thought would steal the limelight from us or that wouldn't allow us to actually put forward the intersectional vision that we had for how we were going to build this together and also the demands that we had in mind. So I don't know if that's possible everywhere, but we also communicated to some of the folks that were down with what we were doing, but also did have a cozier relationship with like politicians, like some of the unions. We asked them to support the coalition, not by being like out in front, but by giving us like the connections, trying to bring in like their members actually into the strategizing sessions. So we weren't just tokenizing and lifting up their stories at opportune moments. And then we also asked them for, pretty direct ways that they could support and sort of limited them in the way that they could support. So like around unions, like, cool, tell us who, you obviously do lots of like power mapping. So tell us like if this person that we're targeting has connections to this bank over here, and that's something that we need to address. So we asked them to take on roles that seemed potentially limited, and I think that worked in a couple of ways. That helped us like stay on the target that we wanted to, the path that we set forward, and it also, since this did become a 4-year fight, I think folks appreciated being asked to show up in very concrete, specific ways, so that they could like build trust, build relationships, get to the longer term vision with us, and not have it be a huge strain on the resources.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Would love to hear either other questions or any examples of divestment strategies you're using in your own work or thinking of trying. And as we wait for folks to reflect, a question that I have for you, Jamie, is as we think about the current calls to abolish ICE and how that hashtag is mainstreaming in this moment, could you share how the prison divestment movement has evolved over the last couple of years to get us here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the prison divestment campaign has done an enormous amount of work at the national level to highlight that we can't just be thinking about criminalization or immigrant detention as two separate things. They are the same system of power, and the focus on private prison targets is a way for us to recognize the lobbying power of like that as an entire industry, but also as a way for us to like have in one set of targets that concrete analysis. And that allows us to and pushes us to like really build movements around that analysis that bridges and builds like Black and brown unity. And that allows us in places where we're not engaged in a site fight, or we don't have a detention center in our backyard, or we don't feel like we have the capacity or analysis to go after the police budget like right now, or that's just too much of a draining fight. Like it gives us another way to fight, and to do so in a way that I think has a really expansive narrative in terms of like what is divestment. It can be shutting down like the system at all levels, but points us in the direction of a couple targets, but is a broader frame, and pushes us to really think about like who needs to be leading that, and who are we leaving out if we just focus on one side of either immigration or criminalization.
Any other insights, questions, comments from folks? Jamie, maybe to close us off, if you can share some tools that folks can use to check on whether their own cities are invested in some of these industries, where would folks go to find that information?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can go to keep an eye on the companies and the pension funds and the state monies that are invested in private prisons. That information is on our website under like prison divestment, under targets, or you can just look up the Million Shares Club on our website. And then you can track that list against your city's own investments. And so you can find out all of that information is going to be publicly available. So some cities make it really easy for you. It's on their website somewhere. Other times you'll have to like figure out the right contact in the Treasury Department or Office of Finance and contact them to get that info. But it's available. It's publicly available.
Before we go into some other resources, does anyone else have anything to share with us? Okay, Jamie?
Sure. So there's resources. There's resources on the freedomcities.org website. There's a toolkit with a case study on the Portland prison divestment campaign, as well as the CS California State Los Angeles divestment campaign that was led by Black students and got concrete reinvestments in Black students. And then there's also case studies around divestment and pushing for reductions in police budgets from other folks in the Freedom Cities network. There's also lots of information around prison divestment specifically on Enlace's webpage, enlaceintl.org/resources. You can contact me or Pearl if you've got any other specific questions. And then we have a petition up around REAT. That's the tax-free status for private prisons. That if you're interested, down to share, we'd love your support on that. That is targeting the Joint Tax Committee, which has the power to actually bring that bill to the floor in their committee and then pass it forward into all of Congress.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you all for taking this hour to join us and learn more about this case study on the strategies that folks on the ground in Portland used. Again, this is our first Think Do Tank webinar, so if anyone has any comments, feedback, suggestions, we would really welcome that. And we hope to incorporate for next month.